So, for our second lecture today, we're going to start and look deeper into suicide bombing. And I think suicide bombing really is a fascinating subject for us to focus on and isolate. And so, my first discussion question that I want you to think about is discussion question one is why should we think about suicide bombings separately versus mass shootings, normal types of bombings, um, hijackings, things like kidnapping, things like this. Why think about suicide bombing separately? And so when you answer this question, I want you to think about things like intensity. I want you to think about the effect. I want you to think about perhaps the seeming irrationality. So I think this is a really good discussion for to have to think about why we're going to focus on suicide bombing as its own particular topic. So, suicide bombing is something that you probably all have heard of to some extent or another. 9/11, good example of suicide bombing attacks when individuals flew into the Pentagon, into into the Twin Towers, were taken down in Pennsylvania before they could actually end up carrying their attack. And so, suicide bombing, before we get into the difficulties of studying it, has actually more of a recent phenomenon. The group that actually really brought about suicide bombing as a major tactic for terrorist organizations is actually a group called the Tamil Tigers. And the Tamil Tigers are an ethnic group on the island of Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean. There are also a lot of Tamils who live in India as well, but the Tamil Tigers as a terrorist organization primarily functioned on the island of Sri Lanka and had a lot of political issues, wanted to have greater control of the politics of Sri Lanka, but were largely in conflict with another ethnic group called the Sinhalese. And the Tamils ended up starting to use suicide bombing as a major tactic in the 1980s and used it as a tactic before many modern Islamically motivated terrorists actually took it up and started using it. So it actually originated from primarily a political um, terrorist organization's agenda, not with the same sense that is ascribed to it in its usage in, say, a Islamically motivated attack to achieve paradise. The Tamil Tigers were not a religious organization and used suicide bombings to achieve a particular political end of greater political control for the Tamils on the island of Sri Lanka. So let's jump in now to thinking about why it's difficult to study suicide terrorism. And there's a lot of issues with it in how we think about trying to assess it. And the first is the idea of, does a suicide attack have to succeed for us to think about it and study it? So there have been instances where individuals have tried to commit suicide and carry out a suicide bombing, and their vests have failed to blow up. They've been unable to detonate a bomb in a car that they were trying to use to carry out their attack. So do we think that when a suicide attack fails, that it should be counted as a suicide attack? It's also a question, and it's important to think about this idea of whether we think that suicide bombing is an act of free will. And we're going to delve into this a little bit more. So, is there instances where individuals are coerced into carrying out suicide attacks? Do we factor those in when we think about and study suicide terrorism? We also have to think about this idea of, does the attacker die? So if they're able to carry out their attack, but for some reason they do not actually kill themselves, do they constitute a suicide bomber even if their intention was to kill themselves? And then we also think about who is the target and how many deaths need to occur for it to truly count. If a suicide bomber kills themselves but doesn't manage to kill anybody else, do we still consider this suicide terrorism? So these are all things that make studying suicide terrorism somewhat difficult. But we also want to try to explain why individuals are willing to engage in suicide terrorism. And we can get back to our ways of thinking and explaining of terrorist acts, this idea of individual explanations as well as organizational explanations. And so when we think about individual, right, we get back to our ideas of psychological versus rational explanations. And so some people have argued that in some ways suicide bombing is actually a rational act and a strategic choice. So this is the idea in some ways that maybe it is the act in and of itself for the individual has some degree of irrationality, but for the group that inspires an individual to carry out the attack, it actually has a rational purpose. That the intensity, the extremity of a suicide attack can further a particular political group's or religious group's objectives. And so this makes it actually a rational decision to have individuals engage in a suicide bombing, even if they then that individual ends up succeeding, killing themselves, killing a lot of other people, even though they lose a potential terrorist to carry out attacks in the future, their loss of life, the benefit of that, of achieving and perhaps achieving some objective based on that attack, outweighs the cost of losing that individual's life. And it's also argued that it's rational because it's largely been seen as a fairly effective tactic for terrorist organizations to use, that it's actually then reinforced its usage. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, that when there oftentimes is a string of suicide attacks, it often can allow terrorist organizations to achieve and extract greater concessions as compared to using other forms of attack. So we also want to think about it in a psychological perspective. So we want to think about this idea of this bomber as a victim model, this idea that, again, we get back to these psychological explanations where we think about perhaps perceived injustices may be shaped in some ways by particular psychological disorders like narcissistic personality disorder, that these individuals might be more willing to engage in carry out suicide attacks if they have some sort of mental disorder that maybe increases their proclivity to being willing to kill themselves, especially if it's in the pursuit of a particular cause that they subscribe to. We also think about it as, from a social psychological perspective, that there is perhaps the capacity for a socialization into the socialization of an individual into being willing to accept the prospects of engaging in a terrorist attack. And we'll delve into this into a little bit more when we talk here about the group explanations. So in the group explanations, these organizational explanations, we can think about it in a couple ways. We can think of the role of religion, and we can think of group influence. So again, we get to this idea of group explanations, especially the idea of group religions. Religions are all based on groups of people coming together, sharing beliefs, helping to influence individuals and inspire them to be willing to carry out these attacks that ultimately ends their own life. And they can oftentimes then justify these decisions to engage in these suicide attacks because of the promise of rewards in the afterlife, some kind of eternal benefit that extends well beyond this life for the rest of time if an individual is willing to engage and carry out these attacks. And then we also have these group influence that sort of, in a lot of ways, fits into that socialization aspect, where groups can help condition an individual to, again, putting the group's interest ahead of their own interest, to become socialized into the idea that them killing themselves, committing suicide, while also killing others to achieve their objective, really truly benefits the group and has a higher purpose than just simply the life of that one particular individual. And individuals will then be willing perhaps to kill themselves if they have the idea that they are ultimately supporting the group, supporting, fighting the out group, fitting into, again, this idea of this us versus them mentality, and ultimately hoping to try to advance the causes of the particular in-group that they belong to. So we want to think about when groups actually use suicide bombing? When is it most likely to occur? And it's been argued that there are 2 points in times in conflicts that groups are more willing and oftentimes use suicide bombings. And one is the height of the conflict, and the other is as a means of last resort. So sometimes it's argued that suicide bombings are more extensive in the middle of a conflict when it's most violent, because a group might perceive the use of suicide bombings, the extremity of it, as being a necessary weapon to try and ultimately shock their opponent into granting concessions, into conceding to their side. If they're willing to ultimately deploy their individuals that belong to their group to kill themselves and kill lots of other people for their objectives, the other side it might be willing to perhaps blink because they see the resolve and commitment that a particular group has. And that's why we might see there's a lot of suicide bombings at the height of a conflict. But we also might see an increase in the usage of suicide bombings by groups as a measure of last resort. If groups are perceived as particularly weak, failing, if it seems that they are potentially going to lose, be wiped out, then maybe they are willing to also resort to suicide bombings more extensively at that point, because at this point they really are at a point where it's argued they're internally, they may be arguing they have no other choice. They're going to potentially lose. We have to try and engage in the most extreme tactics we think are available to us, and suicide bombing fits into that category and is seen as a way to potentially save the group, start a rebound, and prevent them from ultimately being eliminated if they can engage in extreme, intense suicide attacks. Perhaps it allows them to show a sign of strength, increase their recruitment, and pull themselves back from the edge from ultimately being wiped out. So we might also see, again, this increase in suicide bombings as a tactic of last resort. But how do we assess, how effective it is? So we want to see, what are the goals of suicide bombers, and also where does it work best? And it's been argued that suicide attacks and terrorists who use them are most successful when they are trying to combat a democratic government. So one example, it's argued that suicide bombings have been more effective used by Palestinians in Israel because Israel is a democracy, and it's been argued that at the times of peak usage of suicide bombings by Palestinians, Israeli citizens have been much more willing to want to grant concessions and force their government to grant concessions to the Palestinians to end the onslaught of attacks and the extremity of the attacks. So it's argued that it is more effective when it's used against democratic governments that have to respond to their populations who want to see these types of attacks come to an end. So what are some potential policy prescriptions that can ultimately bring about an end to the usage of suicide bombings? Well, one of them is this idea of withdrawal. So we could see in Israel, for example, when they've pulled back from trying to build settlements or occupy places in Palestine, the usage of suicide bombings has actually decreased. Palestinians are less likely to use suicide bombings as a tactic in this case. Or, for example, in the United States, as it draws down the number of troops in Afghanistan or Iraq, the number of suicide attacks against their forces also decrease. So withdrawal concessions are a potential option for reducing the frequency and intensity of suicide attacks. We also see democracy as a potential policy prescription. So if countries are willing to transition to democracy, incorporate the interests of a particular group that has been engaging in suicide bombing attacks, this is an option for potentially ending suicide bombing, as it gives groups a legitimate political outlet to express their grievances rather than having to resort to extreme tactics such as suicide bombing. And then finally, you get into this idea of negotiation. So how do you end suicide attacks with a terrorist organization that commits them, well, it may in some ways also depend on their particular ideological bent, whether they're a secular versus a religious organization. Whereas the Tamil Tigers were using suicide bombing but were a political organization, there may be more room to achieve some sort of settled solution than an attempt to negotiate with a religious terrorist group that sees suicide bombings to some extent as perhaps a way to, like, people who pledge their allegiance to ISIS, of ushering in the apocalypse, bringing about an end times. There's a level of commitment, as we've talked about, with religiously motivated terrorists that differs from more secularly oriented terrorist groups, and this may play an important role in determining when negotiations with groups that carry out suicide bombings might actually work or when it won't. So we'll leave it off there, but I do, to finish up, give you your third discussion question of the day. Is I want to ask you, is suicide bombing rational? Why or why not? Again, is suicide bombing rational? Why or why not? So think about what we've talked about today. Think about your readings and just your general thoughts on the issue. So leave it there. Thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.